There's something funny about Captain America. Not funny strange, necessarily. Well, actually, yes, a bit funny strange. But what I mean is that he's probably the MCU character most people feel like they already understand. You've got your Iron Man fans who spend hours debating which suit had the best reactor output, your Thor fans deep in Norse mythology lore, your Doctor Strange fans who have genuinely mapped out the multiverse on a whiteboard somewhere. And then there's Captain America, who people sort of nod at and say, yeah, good bloke, punches bad guys, very principled, and move on. And I've always found that a little bit unfair, because when you actually sit with the full story, all of it, from a sickly kid in 1930s Brooklyn right through to Sam Wilson, standing in the White House in 2025, it turns out to be one of the richer threads in the entire Marvel universe. Not louder than the others, just deeper, maybe. Quieter in a way that sneaks up on you. So that's what tonight is, a slow walk through all of it. We're going to start at the very beginning, which means Depression-era New York, and a young man who kept trying to enlist in the army, despite being told no repeatedly, by people who had some fairly reasonable medical concerns about him. We'll go through the war, the ice, the long strange experience of waking up 70 years later and having to rebuild a life from scratch. We'll spend some time with the films that I think don't always get their due, The Winter Soldier especially, which holds up as one of the better political thrillers of the 2010s, regardless of the genre it technically belongs to. We'll talk about the fracture that was Civil War, the cost of Infinity War, the quiet dignity of Endgame's ending. And then we'll carry on past Steve Rogers entirely, because the Captain America story doesn't end with him. There's Bucky's whole arc, which is its own quietly devastating thing. There's Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which asked some properly uncomfortable questions about what that shield actually represents and who gets to carry it. And there's Brave New World, the 2025 film that introduces Sam Wilson's Captain America to a world that's changed considerably since Steve first put on the costume. It's a lot of ground. We're not rushing it. If this is the kind of slow, lore-heavy storytelling that helps you drift off, and I suspect it might be, given that you're here, then feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. There are a lot more of these, different corners of the MCU, different rabbit holes. Tonight, though, Steve Rogers. Or rather, the idea of Steve Rogers, and what it's meant to different people across about a century of in-universe time. Right, let's start at the beginning. One small practical note before we do. The structure tonight is modular. Each section stands on its own. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of the Howling Commandos or during the Sokovia Accords, you haven't missed a crucial twist that changes everything. This is one of those videos where falling asleep partway through is genuinely fine. The story will still be here whenever you come back to it. Also worth flagging, tonight we're primarily working from the MCU films and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series. The comics have decades of Captain America stories that diverge significantly from the films. And as much as I'd like to spend 3 hours comparing Steve Rogers' various deaths and resurrections in print, that's a different video. Tonight is the cinematic universe. The films as they are, all 4 Captain America films, the relevant Avengers entries, the Disney Plus show, and the 2025 Brave New World film, which is very recent and which I think doesn't always get discussed in conjunction with the earlier material, but really should be. And there's something fitting about the whole saga being as long as it is. Captain America is, within the in-universe chronology, the character with the longest story, born in 1918, active in WTO2, frozen for about 70 years, fighting in the modern era through to at least 2025. That's a century of story, more than any other Avenger. Thor is older, technically, but Thor's Earth-adjacent history is comparatively recent. Steve's story is woven through the 20th century and into the 21st in a way that makes him one of the few truly historical figures in the franchise. He was there when it started in whatever way you want to define that, and his shadow is in the franchise long after he personally steps away from it. There's also a particular melancholy in that longevity that I find interesting. The people who knew him in the 1940s are gone. The world he understood is gone. Every reference point he had going in was erased while he was in the ice. He came back to a world that had preserved his image as a symbol, while the actual person behind it had been completely absent from its development. The museums dedicated to him, the history books that referenced him, none of that was built by him. It was built about him. That's a strange thing to come back to. More on that as we go. All right, Brooklyn, the 1930s, a kid who kept trying. Here's a detail about Steve Rogers that the films establish early, and then the audience tends to half forget as soon as the transformation happens. He was seriously unwell. Not just skinny in a way that reads as charming on screen unwell. The list of conditions attributed to him in the first Avenger includes asthma, a heart arrhythmia, scarlet fever, rheumatic fever, high blood pressure, and a handful of other things that, taken together, would have made a normal 1940s life fairly difficult, let alone military service. And yet he kept trying to enlist, 5 times by most accounts, different recruitment centres across different cities, listing himself as taller and heavier than he actually was on the forms, which you have to imagine didn't get him very far with the medical examinations. There's something almost stubborn to the point of absurdity about it. This idea of a young man filling out paperwork he knows he's going to fail over and over, just on the off chance that this particular sergeant might look the other way. What that detail tells you about Steve Rogers is arguably more important than anything that happens after the serum. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't driven by some grand sense of destiny. He just believed with complete conviction that what was happening in Europe was wrong, and he believed that the appropriate response to something being wrong was to try and do something about it, regardless of whether you were particularly well equipped to do so. There's a line he delivers when someone asks why he wants to fight so badly. I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from. Simple as that. No grand speech, no destiny, just a fairly uncomplicated moral compass pointing in a consistent direction. The context matters a lot here, the 1930s Brooklyn part of it. The Great Depression had ground through America for the better part of a decade by the time Steve would have been growing up. It was a world where people had very little, and where hardship was just the general condition of existence, not an exception to it. Steve grew up without his father, who died in the First World War and lost his mother to tuberculosis while he was still young. The film doesn't dwell on this. It's in the background rather than the foreground, but it shapes the person he becomes. He's someone who has had things taken from him. He knows what it is to feel small and unprotected. That's part of why the bully thing isn't rhetorical for him. He's not using it as a metaphor. He means it literally. There's a whole texture to the Brooklyn of that era that the first Avenger captures reasonably well in its opening act. The tenements, the crowds, the particular energy of a working-class neighbourhood where everybody knew everybody, and privacy was a theoretical concept. Steve would have grown up in a place where you could hear your neighbours through the walls, where looking out for people on the same block was just what you did, not some elevated moral aspiration. Community as practical necessity rather than civic virtue. The contrast with Tony Stark, which becomes so important later, is already fully formed in these early scenes, even before Tony exists in the story. Tony inherits a world of resources and possibility. Steve inherits nothing except a set of principles he had to arrive at through difficulty. One man eventually builds armor to protect himself. The other throws himself on a grenade to protect the people around him. That's not a judgment. Both impulses make sense given what shaped them, but it explains why they can never fully agree on anything, even when they want the same outcome. The other detail about Steve in this period that I find rather charming is the getting into fights thing. He gets into fights constantly, not because he's aggressive, he's conspicuously not aggressive, but because he keeps seeing something that isn't right and doing something about it. Someone being intimidated in an alley, someone being pushed around outside a cinema. Steve, 5'0" and clinically unwell, inserting himself into the situation. The results are predictable, and he knows they're predictable. He does it anyway. There's a line Bucky delivers in frustration. "You just don't know when to give up, do you?" And Steve's answer, simply, "I can do this all day." That line becomes the Steve Rogers signature, the character's thesis statement in 4 words. And it's not triumphant when he first says it. He's on the ground, having been beaten up behind a cinema, and he's still not interested in staying down. It's not bravery exactly, or not only bravery. It's more like an absolute refusal to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. A stubbornness so deep, it's almost philosophical. And then there's Bucky Barnes. James Buchanan Barnes. Bucky is one of the central relationships in the entire franchise, and it's worth spending some real time on it here, rather than rushing past to get to the action. Because the Steve and Bucky dynamic isn't just a bromance setup or a convenient emotional stake, it's the thing that makes Steve human, throughout everything that follows, even when the story takes him in directions that would otherwise make him feel untouchable. Bucky, as we meet him in the first Avenger, has everything Steve doesn't. He's physically imposing, confident, funny in an easy sort of way. He enlists without trouble, he gets shipped out, and he still looks after Steve, not in a patronizing way, but in the way of someone who genuinely cares about a person and accepts them exactly as they are. When Bucky gets his deployment orders, Steve is devastated, not in a dramatic, weeping way, just quietly, thoroughly gutted. The film handles this with real economy. There's an interesting inversion in their dynamic that I always thought was underplayed in discussions of these characters. Bucky has always been the protected one, in practical terms. He's the one who steps in when Steve's getting beaten up. He's the one who watches Steve's back. He's the competent, capable one in their partnership, at least until the serum. And then suddenly, Steve is the physically powerful one, and Bucky adapts to that without apparent difficulty or resentment, which says something about his character. He's not invested in his role as protector as an identity. He's just invested in Steve's well-being. It doesn't matter to Bucky whether he's the one pulling Steve out of alleyways or the one watching Steve storm a Nazi fortress. The friendship is the thing, not the power dynamic within it. There's also the interesting detail that Steve was an artist. He kept sketchbooks. He drew. There's something about that which the MCU doesn't lean into as much as it could, but it's there. The idea that this morally serious, physically diminished young man had this whole interior life of observation and creativity running underneath everything. It makes him more three-dimensional than the propaganda poster version of Captain America suggests. The sketchbooks show up as a detail again in Endgame. Future Steve, sitting quietly, still drawing. Some habits that deep don't go away. And I always like that detail because it suggests a patience to his character that the action sequences can obscure. Artists observe before they act. They sit with things. They look at the world closely enough to translate it onto a page. That kind of attentiveness is part of what makes Steve a good leader, as well as a good soldier. He notices things, and he's willing to be still long enough for the details to emerge. The reason it's worth establishing all of this before we get anywhere near the serum or the transformation is that Dr. Erskine's whole philosophy, the thing that makes his project different from Johann Schmidt's, rests entirely on this being true of Steve. The serum amplifies what's already there. If what's already there is courage and principle and genuine care for other people, then the result is one thing. And if what's already there is ambition and rage, the result is quite another. Steve Rogers, in other words, was already Captain America before any of the science happened. The science just made it visible. That's the thesis the whole franchise is built around, and it's a thesis that gets tested repeatedly in every subsequent entry. The serum can make a good person better. It can make a bad person catastrophic. But in Erskine's formulation, the human being underneath is what determines the outcome. The power is never the point. Who holds the power is always the point. We'll talk about that science next because it's more interesting than it sounds, and Erskine himself is one of the most underappreciated characters in the whole franchise. Dr. Abraham Erskine is in the first Avenger for maybe 20 minutes of screen time. He gets assassinated before the third act, and yet the entire moral architecture of the Captain America story rests on things he said in those 20 minutes. It's one of those performances, Stanley Tucci, if you're curious, where the actor does so much with so little that the character's absence is felt throughout the rest of the film and throughout the rest of the franchise. What makes Erskine interesting is that he's not a tragic figure in the way of a scientist whose creation got out of hand. He knew exactly what the serum could do wrong, because he'd already seen it. Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, though we'll get to him properly in a later section, was Erskine's first test subject. Schmidt demanded to be the first, insisted on it, and Erskine administered the procedure under conditions that were not ideal, under pressure from the Nazi hierarchy that had effectively captured him. The result was a man of extraordinary physical capability and a personality that had been, as Erskine puts it, stripped of all weakness, including the human ones. So when Erskine defects and begins rebuilding the program from scratch with the Americans, he does so with a completely different set of criteria. He's not looking for the strongest candidate or the most decorated soldier. He's looking for someone whose baseline character is good, because his whole thesis is that the serum doesn't create heroism, it reveals it, or more accurately, it amplifies what's latent. Good becomes better, cruel becomes monstrous. That's why Steve passes the evaluation when everyone else thinks he should be disqualified. Colonel Chester Phillips, a very pragmatic man with very pragmatic metrics for success, throws a grenade into the training field during an exercise to test how the candidates respond. Everyone runs. Steve dives on top of it. It's a fake grenade, as it turns out, but Steve didn't know that. And his reasoning afterward is lovely in its simplicity. He thought it was real, so he did what seemed necessary to protect the people around him. Phillips isn't moved by this, interestingly. He's still skeptical. He wants the biggest, best-trained soldier he can get, and Steve is neither. It's Erskine who holds firm, and the conversation between them the night before the procedure, the one where Erskine shares a beer with Steve and explains his philosophy, is where the film earns everything that comes after. Erskine says, essentially, that a strong man who has always been strong has never had to develop courage, because he's never truly needed it. A man who has been weak and has chosen to act anyway, that's different. That's someone who has built his character from the inside out rather than the outside in. Steve has never known an easy day. Every decision he's made to stand up for something has cost him something real, because he had so little to begin with. This is the scene the franchise keeps returning to without always naming it. Every time a later story asks whether the power or the person is what matters, and the franchise asks this question constantly in different ways with different characters, the answer is already here. In a small room, over a beer, the night before, everything changes. A scientist telling a young man that the serum will make him what he already is. There's also something Erskine says that's easy to miss on a first watch. He tells Steve, before the procedure, to stay who he is. Not be brave or be strong, just stay who he is, because the serum will take everything and amplify it, and if who he is at his core is good, then the result will be good. But if something shifts, if the experience or the power changes him in some fundamental way, then the whole thing has failed, regardless of the physical results. Steve remembers this. You can see it operating in him throughout the rest of the franchise, this awareness of himself, this checking in against a baseline of values. There's a small moment early in the first Avenger that I always come back to. Before the procedure, Erskine tells Steve about Schmidt, about what happened when the serum went wrong, about the face beneath the face. He doesn't tell Steve this to frighten him. He tells him because he wants Steve to understand what the serum is measuring. It's not measuring strength or speed or pain tolerance. It's measuring what's underneath. And Erskine, who has spent years in the dark heart of the Nazi program and has come out the other side building something different, seems really moved by the fact that he found someone in whom he trusts what's underneath. That faith costs Erskine his life, within hours. And the thing he built from it, the super soldier, the idea, the living proof of his thesis, is still walking around, or sitting in an ice drift, or fighting in Washington, or handing off a shield on a riverbank 80 years later. The proof outlasted the scientist. That's not nothing. It's why he walks away from the shield in Siberia. Not because he's defeated, but because he's being true to a version of himself that doesn't use a weapon made by the father of the man he just hurt. The serum didn't give him that sense of self. It was already there. The serum just gave it more to work with. The procedure itself is quite remarkable in the way the film stages it. Steve in this large hydraulic chair, intravenous serum, high-intensity Vita-Ray exposure, the whole thing watched by about a dozen scientists and military observers. It hurts considerably, and Steve asks them to keep going when they're ready to stop. And then he emerges, tall, broad-shouldered, physically transformed in every way. And the first thing he does is look mildly confused about where his clothes went. It works. It obviously works. And the energy in the room is briefly extraordinary. All those months of preparation, all Erskine's patient argument against the skeptics, and here is the proof. Here is what he was talking about. Then, before anyone has a chance to celebrate, or take measurements, or do any of the things you'd expect to happen after a successful scientific breakthrough, a Nazi spy who has been watching from the gallery shoots Erskine and steals a vial of the serum. Steve gives chase, catches the man, but not before the spy takes a cyanide capsule to avoid interrogation. Erskine dies, and the knowledge of the formula dies with him. This is not a detail that gets revisited as often as it deserves. There is no backup. There are no notes sufficient to reconstruct the serum. The process is lost. Steve is, actually, and permanently unique. Not just special, but singular. There is no plan to create more super soldiers using Erskine's method, because nobody alive understands Erskine's method well enough to replicate it. Every attempt that comes after, every super soldier program we encounter across the films and the shows, is someone else trying to reverse engineer something they only partially understand, usually with catastrophic results. The serum that produces John Walker in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The experiments run on Bucky by Hydra. The gamma radiation that produced Bruce Banner's Hulk was itself a misguided attempt to replicate the super soldier process. Banner thought he understood the serum well enough to adapt it, and he was wrong in a very large and green way. Every one of these failed derivatives traces back to Erskine's death in a laboratory in Brooklyn in 1943. That failure mode is sewn into the beginning of the whole saga, and it matters a great deal to the Isaiah Bradley story we'll talk about much later on. There's also a structural irony in the serum's origins that the MCU tends to skip past rather quickly. Howard Stark built the machinery that delivered the Vita-Ray component. Howard Stark, whose son Tony will spend decades building increasingly sophisticated armor, largely in reaction to his father's legacy of weapons manufacturing. The super soldier serum, the most significant human enhancement technology the MCU has produced, was partly the work of the same man whose other work was being used to arm conflict zones around the world. Howard contains these contradictions and never really resolves them, which his son inherits in different form. The other thing worth noting here is Peggy Carter, who has been somewhat criminally underused as a character in discussions of this franchise. She is, at the point we meet her in the first Avenger, a British officer embedded with the American military program, highly capable, not remotely charmed by men who mistake confidence for competence, and immediately able to see what Erskine sees in Steve. She's also the one who, after the transformation, slugs a soldier who tries to touch Steve's newly formed chest muscles without permission. Agent Carter, Colonel Phillips says mildly, "That's quite enough." And she just looks at Steve and says, "I had to make sure it was real." Their relationship, the thing that eventually becomes the unfinished dance, the radio call into the ice, begins not with physical attraction, but with genuine mutual respect. She respects his integrity. He respects her competence. It's a romance built on shared values, which is relatively rare in blockbuster filmmaking and worth recognizing when it shows up. Peggy's own story, which the TV series Agent Carter explored in the 1940s period after the events of the first Avenger, deserves a mention here because it's quite good and because it shows you what the character was doing while Steve was in the ice. She co-founds S.H.I.E.L.D. She builds the institution from scratch, alongside Howard Stark and Chester Phillips. She does it quietly, without credit, and later watches it become something complicated in ways she couldn't have anticipated. There's a quiet tragedy in Peggy's arc. She built the thing that kept Steve on ice for decades, in a sense. She wouldn't have known that. But it's there. After Erskine's death, the military pivots. The scientific program is over. Steve is the only result. And so the question becomes, what do you do with a super soldier when you've lost the scientist who made him? The answer the government came up with was a bit embarrassing, honestly. The Captain America stage show is one of the better jokes in the first Avenger, and also one of its more pointed observations. Steve Rogers, brave, principled, a genuine military asset, and newly transformed into a physical specimen of extraordinary capability, is put in a costume and sent across America to sell war bonds. 200 Cities, the USO circuit, a theatrical performance involving chorus girls and a pre-scripted script and a prop shield. There's even a brief film within a film, a black and white Captain America adventure serial, which in the MCU is technically just propaganda rather than the actual comic books, which is a layer of self-awareness the film plays very dry. Steve hates it, not in a loud complaining way. He's too principled for that, but you can see it. He goes through the performances with genuine professionalism, because that's what he does. He tries to do whatever's asked of him well. But after each performance, he's in the wings looking at maps of Europe, drawing in his sketchbook, asking questions about unit deployments that nobody thinks it's his place to be asking. The interesting thing is that the military's logic isn't entirely wrong from their perspective. Steve is the only super soldier. There is no second version. Deploying him in the field risks an irreplaceable asset, and the morale value of the Captain America persona, the idea that America has this symbol, this figure, is real and quantifiable. Colonel Phillips isn't being cynical when he keeps Steve in the show. He's making a resource allocation decision. But he's also completely missing what makes Steve actually valuable, which is the part Erskine understood. Steve isn't valuable because of his physical capabilities, or not only because of those. He's valuable because of the character that produces those capabilities. The stubbornness, the refusal to accept that something bad is unavoidable, the commitment to going back for the one person everyone else has written off. There's also something quietly pointed about the propaganda show version of Steve Rogers. The Captain America on stage is an icon, simplified, patriotic, constructed for maximum public appeal. He poses. He punches a man in a red skull mask on stage nightly. He exists entirely within a script. And the film uses this to set up what it means to actually be Captain America versus performing the idea of it. John Walker in Falcon and the Winter Soldier will eventually dramatize this distinction much more explicitly, but the seed is here. The costume and the title and the performance are one thing. The character beneath them is something else, and it's the second thing that matters. The chorus girls are very enthusiastic. The crowds love it. Steve signs photographs. He does the shows. He's perfectly nice about all of it. He's also clearly not where he needs to be. The shield, which we should spend a moment on, arrives in this section of the story through one of those lovely bits of incidental world building that the MCU does well. Howard Stark Tony's father, a weapons manufacturer and technical genius who is heavily involved with the Super Soldier program, presents Steve with a number of prototype shields in a testing session. Most of them are impractical, in one way or another, and then Steve notices one leaning against the wall, slightly off to the side, and picks it up. Vibranium, round, perfectly balanced, it absorbs impact without deformation. Steve uses it to deflect a few test blasts, and Stark, slightly irritated, points out that he's just grabbed the most expensive thing in the room. The entire vibranium reserve the country had at the time, worked into a disc. Steve keeps it, obviously. Vibranium is a material that comes from Wakanda, though that country's true capabilities and resources aren't revealed to the wider MCU until much later, and the detail that Howard Stark had access to some of it in the early 1940s is quietly significant. It raises questions about the relationship between Wakanda and the outside world during that era that the Black Panther films touch on, without fully exploring. How did Howard Stark get vibranium? What did he trade for it? These are the kinds of historical wrinkles the MCU occasionally gestures toward and then leaves hanging. The shield becomes as much a part of the Captain America identity as anything else. Its circular shape means it has no edges, which is a design choice that was not accidental. A weapon that is also a defensive tool, and whose shape carries a specific cultural meaning. No corners, no sharp points, something inclusive rather than aggressive. It's a bit on the nose, but it works, partly because the films are honest about the symbolism rather than pretending the shield is just practically convenient. The question of how Howard Stark had vibranium in the 1940s is one of those threads the franchise leaves conspicuously unaddressed. Wakanda was isolationist at the time, deliberately so, concealing its true technological capabilities and its vibranium reserves from the world. Some controlled amount of the material had apparently made its way into international circulation, possibly through Wakandan intermediaries operating under cover identities. The implication is that Wakanda knew exactly what the vibranium was being used for, that they allowed, perhaps deliberately enabled, the creation of the Captain America shield, knowing what the war was, knowing who Steve Rogers would become. It's a reading the MCU never confirms, but it sits quietly at the edge of the history, interesting to consider. The shields later return to Wakanda, and then its passage through Steve to Sam, through Wakandan hands, that built a new suit to go with it, adds another layer to this. Wakanda is involved in the Captain America story at the beginning and at the end. Whatever their reasons in 1943, they end up deeply invested in how the symbol continues. The moment Steve actually becomes useful, the moment the propaganda show version of Captain America gives way to the real one, comes when he learns that Bucky's regiment has been captured in Italy. 2,000 men, and the military's position is that they're lost, that a rescue operation isn't viable, that you have to accept these things. Steve does not accept these things. He steals a plane, basically. He borrows Peggy and Howard Stark's transport, flies himself over the Alps, parachutes in alone, walks into a Hydra facility that's holding the prisoners, and gets them all out. By himself, with a dustbin lid for a shield, since the actual shield is back at the base. The reason this sequence is so satisfying is the same reason the stage show sequence is frustrating. It's finally Steve doing the thing he was always trying to do, not the performance of it. The stage show was a version of heroism that was controlled and contained and pointed in a commercially useful direction. The Italy rescue is the real version, messy, unsanctioned, motivated by the specific love for one specific person, using whatever's available. The 2,000 men he frees are truly grateful. But Steve wasn't there for the 2,000 men. He was there for Bucky, and the rest just happened to be in the same building. Bucky's face when he sees Steve, this tiny, sickly kid he'd grown up with, now 6 feet tall and built like a statue, is quite funny. "Steve," he says, and then, "What happened to you?" and Steve says, "I joined the army." It's a good line. The film earns it. And it works partly because the audience has spent enough time with pre-serum Steve that the reunion lands differently than it would if the transformation were purely physical. Bucky doesn't just see a bigger version of his friend, he sees his friend who did something completely impractical and somewhat insane and walked into a Hydra facility with a metal disc because that's what Steve does. The specific quality of it is recognizable. From there, the rescue becomes the official debut of the actual Captain America, the soldier, not the show, and the formation of the Howling Commandos, the specialized unit that will spend the next year or so making Hydra's existence extremely uncomfortable. Hydra is an interesting villain organization because it's never quite just a military force. Even in the 1940s, when it's operating as a division of the Nazi war machine, there's something about its structure and its ideology that's more like a cult than a conventional army. The name is deliberate, from the Greek mythological creature that grows 2 heads for everyone that's cut off. The motto repeated in every adaptation is "cut off 1 head and 2 more shall take its place." The organizational philosophy is one of resilience through redundancy and secrecy. Hydra doesn't win by dominating the field, it wins by not dying. Johann Schmidt is at the centre of all of this, and he's a character the films do interesting things with, despite his relatively straightforward surface appearance. He's the Red Skull, literally a man whose face has been permanently disfigured by the super soldier process, leaving his skin a deep crimson and his features almost inhuman. That transformation is a consequence of what we talked about in the previous section. He received the serum before Erskine had properly refined it, under conditions that were less than controlled, and the result amplified the parts of Schmidt that were already pointing toward the worst possible outcomes. What the film is doing with Schmidt is making him an explicit dark mirror of Steve. They have the same physical template: enhanced strength, enhanced durability, the product of the same scientific process. But where Steve's character before the serum was grounded in genuine care for other people, Schmidt's was rooted in ambition and an absolute conviction of his own superiority. The serum took that and made it enormous. By the time we meet him, he's not really interested in the Nazi movement anymore. He's outgrown it. Hitler and his ambitions strike Schmidt as small. He wants the world, all of it. The Tesseract is what makes this possible. Or at least that's what Schmidt believes. The Tesseract, a glowing blue cube of enormous energy output, is where things get cosmically interesting, in a way the film gestures toward without fully explaining. We now know from later entries in the franchise that the Tesseract is the Space Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones, objects of near unlimited power that predate the universe itself. But in the first Avenger, it's simply an ancient artifact of unknown origin that Hydra discovered buried in Norway, and that turns out to be capable of generating energy on a scale that makes conventional weapons look like toys. Hydra has built an entire weapons program around harnessing it. Energy cannons that vaporize targets instantly. Technology that's decades ahead of anything the Allies have. There's a quiet piece of world building here that's easy to miss. Schmidt found the Tesseract in a church in Tunsberg, Norway, hidden behind a carving of Yggdrasil, the Norse world tree, which means Asgard had something to do with how it ended up on Earth. Thor's people. Schmidt even says at one point that the Tesseract was the jewel of Odin's treasure room. This is seeded here in a 2011 film, paying off threads that won't fully resolve until a decade later. That kind of long-range planning is one of the things the MCU did well in its early phase. And it's interesting that the first major threat in the MCU's history is powered by a cosmic object that Odin apparently misplaced. The Asgardians, who position themselves as protectors of the 9 realms, and who Thor repeatedly cites as defenders of Earth in particular, apparently left this immensely powerful artifact somewhere accessible enough that a Nazi occultist found it in a Norwegian church. There's something quietly absurd about that, and the franchise never fully addresses it, which I find charming in a slightly maddening way. Sorry about the all-powerful object that powered a weapons program for a terrorist organization. We'll try to be more careful with the others. Thor, presumably, at some point in private. The Tesseract's history before Schmidt is itself a story the franchise only partially tells. It ends up in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody after the war. Studied for decades, eventually becomes the focus of Loki's invasion plot in the first Avengers film, is then kept in Asgard, and finally is destroyed by Thanos, who extracts the Space Stone from within it. But its time in Norway, before Schmidt, during however many centuries Asgard apparently left it there, is a blank space. A long stretch of human history during which an infinitely powerful cosmic object was sitting in a church on the Norwegian coast. History, as the MCU occasionally reminds you, is stranger than it appears, but we should talk about the Howling Commandos, because they deserve more than a footnote. The team Steve assembles, or rather, the team that coalesces around Steve after the prisoner rescue, is notable for its composition. Dum Dum Dugan, the large cheerful one with the bowler hat. Gabe Jones, who speaks multiple languages and carries a bazooka. Jim Morita, Jacques Dernier, Montgomery Falsworth, and Bucky, who has rejoined the unit and who is, by this point, in fact, excellent sniper. International, diverse, operating in a war that was in many respects defined by nationalism and ethnic hatred, the Commandos represent something the Captain America mythology has always wanted to say about what America at its best is supposed to be. A coalition, people from everywhere working towards something together. Morita is Japanese American, fighting for a country that was simultaneously interning Japanese American civilians on the West Coast. The film doesn't make a speech about this, it's just true. The contradiction is present, and it's left to sit there quietly, which is actually the more powerful choice, showing you that the ideal and the reality were in conflict without pretending that acknowledgement resolves the conflict. There's a scene of the Commandos just existing together, eating, talking, laughing around a fire somewhere in the middle of a European winter, that the film uses almost as a rest point before the action resumes. It's brief, but it does what good ensemble scenes do. It makes you believe these people know each other, that they've been in enough situations together that the energy between them is easy and specific. Steve sits in the middle of it, and for maybe the first time in the film, he looks like someone who belongs somewhere. I also want to note, since we're here, that the Howling Commandos represent something in the franchise that doesn't get fully explored and probably should. What happened to them after the war? What was it like to have fought alongside Captain America, to have watched him go down with the plane, and to then live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives? Jim Morita went on to have a family that eventually included the characters from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. years and generations later. Gabe Jones apparently lived into at least the early 2000s. Dum Dum Dugan has a complicated history in the comics involving life model decoys that the MCU has never touched. These are people who are shaped by their time with Steve Rogers, who lost him and who then had to explain him to the world for the next 7 decades. The museum exhibit isn't an abstraction to them. It's their friend, in a box, in the past. Their experience of that is something I'd properly like to see explored at some point. There's a story there about legacy and loss and memory that the franchise has so far only gestured toward. The missions accumulate, the Hydra bases come down one by one. Red Skull watches from his fortress, not quite believing that these few people are dismantling his operation piece by piece, and developing something approaching genuine respect for Steve, or at least a fascination with him as the one worthy opponent. There's a scene between Schmidt and Steve in the final act that I find interesting precisely because it refuses to mirror them too completely. Schmidt tells Steve that they are the same, both enhanced, both set apart from ordinary humanity, both operating on a level other people can't reach. Steve's response is essentially that they are not the same, and he says this without any particular drama, just with the specific clarity of someone who knows what's different about himself. and doesn't need to explain it. Schmidt sees their shared physical capability. Steve sees something else as the defining characteristic of a person. And then there's the train. The mission on the Hydra train is where Bucky dies, or where everyone believes Bucky dies. He falls from the side of the train onto the valley floor below, hundreds of feet down, after the side of the carriage tears away. Steve tries to reach him, almost loses his own grip, and can't get there in time. It's handled with real restraint. No dramatic music swell, no drawn-out farewell. Just Bucky's face, surprised and then gone. The film cuts away before you've fully processed it, which is actually how sudden loss tends to work. The mind refuses the information briefly, looks for evidence of a different outcome, and then has to accept something it can't quite make real yet. Steve blames himself. He will blame himself for this for the rest of his life, or what he thinks is the rest of his life. There's an interesting way in which the train scene is the emotional heart, not just of the first Avenger, but of the entire franchise. Every major Steve Rogers moment that follows is in some way a response to this one. He volunteers to take the plane down into the Arctic, rather than risk the bombs reaching American cities, and the version of that sacrifice that makes sense is partly the one shaped by what just happened on the train. He couldn't save Bucky. He can save these people. He could not stop this loss. He can stop this one. The grief shapes the heroism, even when neither the film nor the character names it explicitly. The weight of that moment, the specific grief of a friend who trusted you and was in that situation because of you, is something Steve carries quietly through everything that comes after, including the moment, decades later, when he discovers what actually happened to Bucky. But that's for another section. There's also the dimension of survivor's guilt here, that the films don't spell out, but that's legible if you're looking for it. Steve was the super soldier. Steve was the enhanced one. Steve was the one who should have been able to pull Bucky back, if anyone could have. And he couldn't. That failure, not just losing a friend, but being unable to prevent it despite having capabilities beyond ordinary human limits, is a specific kind of grief that adds a layer to everything Steve does afterward. He can do remarkable things, and the one time it would have mattered most for someone he loved, it wasn't enough. The finale of the first Avenger is one of the MCU's most elegantly constructed endings. Red Skull's plan to launch a fleet of massive aircraft carrying Hydra bombs to major American cities is stopped by Steve, who boards the command plane and fights Schmidt directly. The fight ends when Schmidt handles the Tesseract with his bare hands. The object responds by opening a portal of some kind and simply taking Schmidt, teleporting him, burning him away, removing him from the board. His fate is left deliberately ambiguous, though the MCU does eventually clarify it in Infinity War. Schmidt was transported to Vormir, the planet where the Soul Stone is kept, and has been its guardian ever since, bound to that barren world, unable to leave. It's a strange and somewhat melancholy fate for someone who wanted the whole universe. He ends up on a rock, alone, directing others to the thing he couldn't reach himself. But the plane is still in the air, still loaded with bombs, still headed for the eastern seaboard. And Steve makes the decision. He calls Peggy on the radio. They talk about the dance they never got to have. She tells him they'll find a time and a place for it, and her voice is completely steady, which might be the bravest performance in the film. And then the signal fades and Steve takes the plane down into the Arctic Ocean. He was 26 years old. What Steve Rogers sacrificed is worth sitting with for a moment, because the films do move past it fairly quickly. He was 26. He'd been given extraordinary physical capability and had used it honestly and bravely for what turned out to be about 18 months of actual combat. He'd lost his best friend. He'd had about 3 meaningful conversations with the woman he loved and had never managed a single dance. And then he made a rational decision to die, because the alternative was allowing something terrible to happen to other people. The Arctic does not kill him. The serum preserves him. S.H.I.E.L.D. finds the plane in the modern era, The opening scene of the first Avenger, which then flips back to the 1940s to tell us how we got there, and recovers his body, still frozen, still technically alive in some suspended state that nobody fully understands. The effort S.H.I.E.L.D. makes to ease Steve's transition into the present day is both touching and completely futile. They stage a hospital room in what appears to be the 1940s. They have an actor in the room pretending to be a nurse. They play a wartime radio broadcast of a baseball game that Steve recognizes as a match he actually attended. The deception lasts about 30 seconds. Steve clocks the fact that the game's commentary is wrong. He was at that game, he knows what happened, and walks out of the facility into Times Square, 2011. The choice to have a baseball game be what gives it away is a good one. Steve knows baseball. He knows it the way you know the things that were part of the texture of your life, not as facts you remember, but as experiences you carry. The commentary doesn't sound like the game he was at because he was there, and it wasn't like this. You can fake a lot of things about a person's past. You can't fake the felt knowledge of someone who was present. 70 years. The ice held him for 7 decades. The MCU doesn't dwell on Steve's grief as long or as deeply as it probably should, which I think is a fair criticism of the first Avenger and of the Avengers film that follows. Steve lost everyone. Not just Bucky, not just Peggy, everyone. His unit, the people he grew up with, the city he knew, the world that made sense to him. He wakes up in a future where he's a museum exhibit and a propaganda symbol, and essentially a historical artifact, and the emotional processing of that is compressed into a few scenes of him boxing and looking at old photographs and quietly noting things he needs to catch up on in a small notebook. There's a notebook of references he's keeping to things he needs to look up, cultural touchstones, historical events, things everyone around him already knows. The version of this list we see in The Winter Soldier varies depending on which country you're watching the film in. It was localised, so British audiences got references to different cultural touchstones than American audiences, which is a small production detail I find charming. The idea that Steve's catch-up list is geography-specific, that what counts as common knowledge is local. His apartment in Washington, where he's living during The Winter Soldier, is sparse and functional. He runs every morning around the National Mall, which is a very 1940s soldier thing to do, and also just quite earnest. He works for S.H.I.E.L.D. because that's the only institutional framework that connects to anything he recognises, even though his trust in it is conditional and his relationship with authority has never been uncomplicated. The phrase the MCU uses, "a man out of time," is actually quite precise in a way that the films don't always unpack. It's not just that Steve is confused by modern technology or unfamiliar with current events. It's that the moral framework he was raised in, 1930s and 1940s working-class Brooklyn, shaped by economic depression and genuine global conflict with an unmistakably evil adversary, was one of unusual clarity. Good and evil were clearer. The stakes were more tangible. The enemy wore a uniform and a specific insignia. What Steve comes back to is a world of ambiguity, of institutional compromise, of threats that wear friendly faces and carry legal authority. He finds this harder not because he's simple-minded, he clearly isn't, but because the tools he has for navigating moral complexity were built in a context where the complexity was of a different kind. And here's a thing the films handle well without making a big speech about it. Steve's 1940s upbringing means he was shaped by a very specific kind of American patriotism, one based on the ideals rather than the institutions. He believes in what America is supposed to be. He's considerably less certain about whether any specific American institution is actually pursuing that. His deep skepticism of Project Insight in The Winter Soldier isn't cynicism. It comes from his own era's understanding that institutions can be corrupted, and that the flag on the wall is not a guarantee of the ethics of the people beneath it. He saw it with Hydra. He saw what unchecked power with a compelling justification could produce. The world he comes back to is enormously different from the one he left, politically, technologically, socially, and Steve navigates it with more grace than he's often given credit for. He doesn't rail against it, doesn't wallow in nostalgia, but the loss is real and it runs underneath everything. The scene in the Avengers where he tells Nick Fury he's been in the ice for decades is a simple piece of exposition, and it lands as one too, but if you read it generously, there's an enormous amount of experience compressed into that one sentence. The man who wakes from the ice is not a fundamentally different person from the boy who went into it. The same moral compass, the same stubbornness, the same genuine care for people, just more alone than he's ever been. And about to meet a team of people who, one by one, are going to become the closest thing to a family he has in this era. Which brings us to New York and the Avengers, and what happens when you assemble a group like that for the first time. The Avengers is a strange film when you think about what it's actually trying to do. You have 6 characters from 4 separate franchises, varying wildly in genre and tone. Thor's world is Shakespearean mythology. Iron Man is a tech billionaire action comedy. Captain America is a woo drama, and the task is to put them all in a room together and have it make sense. The fact that it does make sense, mostly, is down to the writers understanding something important. The most interesting dynamic in the film is not the heroes versus Loki, it's Steve Rogers versus Tony Stark. They do not get along immediately. This is putting it charitably. The way the film sets them up, they are essentially designed to irritate each other. Tony is improvisational, sarcastic, motivated by ego, and also by genuine genius, constitutionally incapable of following instructions he hasn't agreed with. Steve is principled, structured, intensely loyal to the chain of command in the abstract even when skeptical of specific commands, and has essentially no tolerance for people who treat serious situations as occasions for wit. Tony's line to Steve, "Everything special about you came out of a bottle," is one of those cruelties that lands because it has some structural truth to it. And Steve's response about whether Tony would sacrifice himself for a cause is also pointed. They're each holding up a mirror to the other, and neither of them particularly likes what they see. What makes this work as a dynamic, rather than just friction for friction's sake, is that both of them are right about some things and wrong about others. Tony is right that Steve's view of authority and institutions is naive. The Winter Soldier will make this explicit. Steve is right that Tony's self-sufficiency is a kind of armor against genuine vulnerability and genuine commitment. And over the course of the film, they arrive at a point where they can function as part of the same team without resolving the underlying tension between them, which is actually more realistic than a clean reconciliation would have been. Steve's relationship with Thor is interesting in a completely different way. These are 2 people from radically different worlds. One is a Norse god, technically over 1,000 years old, from a civilization that uses sufficiently advanced technology that it looks like magic. The other is a human man from Brooklyn, who would be about 27 if not for the cryogenic interruption. And they get along. There's a mutual respect that arrives fairly quickly, based largely on the fact that both of them are people who take their responsibilities seriously, and neither of them uses rank as a substitute for actual engagement. Thor's scene with Steve in the forest, where they fight briefly, and it ends roughly in a draw, and Clint makes an extremely dry joke about putting a bird on a barrel, is one of the better character introductions in the film. Bruce Banner is the relationship Steve handles with the most particular care. Bruce is living with a condition that the world largely treats as a threat, and his own relationship with it is fraught and complicated in ways that Steve recognizes at a distance from his own experience. Steve was also given something extraordinary without his full understanding of what it would mean. He was also turned into something the military wanted to own and use. He also had to build a life around being different in a fundamental way from everyone around him. He handles the Bruce relationship with a specific gentleness that I notice the films don't always get credit for. The Battle of New York, Loki's invasion, the Chitauri army through the portal, is where the Avengers become real as a team, rather than a collection of individuals who happen to be in the same location. And if you pay attention to the battle, Steve's role in it is fascinating. He's the one directing people. Thor goes there, Tony does this, Natasha handles the portal, Clint covers the perimeter, Steve himself is on the ground, street level, coordinating police and civilians, doing the unglamorous practical work. He doesn't have the biggest weapons or the flashiest moments, but the battle, to the extent it's coordinated, rather than just chaotic, is coordinated because of him. There's a nice character note in here. Of all the Avengers, Steve is the most at home in a war. Not because he likes it, the film is very clear that he doesn't, but because he's the one who has done it before. Really done it. Not in a suit or with magic, just on the ground, in the noise, making decisions under pressure and living with them. After New York, the team disperses. There's no formal Avengers organization at this point. S.H.I.E.L.D. exists, and Steve is working for it, but there's already a low-grade unease in his relationship with Nick Fury, and with the institution more broadly. He follows the mission briefs, he does the work, but he asks questions that people don't always want to answer, and he notices things that don't add up. His friendship with Natasha Romanoff develops during this period into something real and specific. It's not romantic, and the films never push it to be. It's more like a mutual professional respect that becomes something warmer through shared experience and a shared willingness to tell each other uncomfortable truths. Natasha operates in grey areas that Steve finds troubling. She lies to achieve outcomes, which is sometimes the right call and sometimes isn't. Steve finds this difficult. Natasha finds Steve's discomfort with complexity a bit impractical. But they trust each other, and that trust gets tested thoroughly in what comes next. Steve's work with S.H.I.E.L.D. in this period is useful and quite motivated, but there's always a slight dissonance underneath it. He's working inside a large institution again, following the chain of command, doing what's asked of him, and the institution is doing things he doesn't know about and wouldn't necessarily agree with if he did. That dissonance is quiet, not dramatic. It's just there, underneath the surface of every clean mission, slightly out of sight. There's a scene in The Winter Soldier, before the action starts properly, where Steve visits the Smithsonian and looks at a display about the Howling Commandos, his own exhibit, his own face on a placard with dates and a brief biography. There are kids in the room who don't notice him, because who expects the exhibit to just be standing there? He reads about himself as though learning something he'd forgotten. There's a recording of Peggy talking about him from, presumably, some decades later. Older, her voice still recognisably hers. He listens to it from around a corner. He doesn't approach, he just listens, and then walks away. It's a 30-second scene that the film gives exactly the right amount of space, and then moves on from. It tells you everything about where Steve is emotionally in this period, without dramatising it into something uncomfortable. The past is still there. It's in a glass case in a federal building. He can visit it, but he can't stay. Because The Winter Soldier is not just about a villain. It's about an institution Steve trusted, turning out to be something he should never have trusted at all. The Winter Soldier is, I'd argue, the best standalone Captain America film. I know reasonable people disagree with this. The first Avenger has a different kind of emotional clarity to it. But in terms of craft, in terms of what it's attempting as a piece of filmmaking, The Winter Soldier is doing something worth sitting with. It's a 1970s political thriller wearing a superhero costume. The surveillance state, the preemptive elimination of threats, the question of how much freedom you trade for how much security. These are not new ideas, but the film handles them with more care than you might expect from a blockbuster. The opening mission, the rescue of hostages aboard a ship called the Lemurian Star, is where things start to crack. Steve and a S.H.I.E.L.D. strike team take the vessel from pirates with enormous efficiency. But in the middle of the operation, Steve notices that Natasha has gone off mission. She's copying files, intelligence files, not the hostage rescue. Steve asks about this and is told, essentially, that she had orders he wasn't briefed on. This is a small thing. Operationally, it probably doesn't matter, but it matters enormously to Steve, because it means that the mission he was given and the actual operation he participated in were not the same thing. He was used as a distraction for something he wasn't told about. And if that's true of this mission, how many other missions has it been true of? Nick Fury gets shot by the Winter Soldier shortly afterward. The attack is brutal, efficient, and happens in the middle of a Washington street in daylight, which tells you something about how serious this threat is. Fury makes it to Steve's apartment, hands him a drive, says don't trust anyone, and then appears to die. Steve is immediately named as a suspect, as a liability, and has to go on the run. And then the investigation into the Winter Soldier reveals something that changes everything. James Buchanan Barnes, Steve's best friend, the man who fell from a train in the Alps in 1944. He didn't die. Hydra found him. He had hit the frozen ground of a mountainside and lost his left arm and some portion of his memory, and Hydra took what was left and spent the better part of 2 decades turning him into something else. A weapon. A precision instrument of assassination, deployed periodically and put back into cryogenic storage between missions to prevent the kind of long-term personality integration that might lead to someone having thoughts of their own. The metal arm is an iconic visual, and it's worth understanding what it represents: the replacement of a human part with something functional. The arm is excellent for combat. It has no feeling. It can be detached, upgraded, repaired. It is in every way the opposite of the organic limb it replaced, and the choice to make Bucky's transformation legible through that specific visual, human replaced by machine, is not accidental, but we'll come back to Bucky. Let's stay on Hydra. The discovery of Camp Lehigh, an abandoned shield installation, leads Steve and Natasha to one of the more properly unsettling moments in the franchise. In the basement, behind a wall of obsolete technology, is Arnim Zola, a Hydra scientist from the WHO2 who died in the 1970s. Except Zola had his consciousness digitized before his biological death and loaded into S.H.I.E.L.D.'s computer systems, where he has been sitting for decades, quietly doing what he was doing. He explains in this calm, pleased sort of way what's been happening. Zola is a fascinating character because he appeared in the original film, played broadly as a nervous, physically unimpressive scientist who survived World War II by offering his services to the Allies, rather than dying with the organisation he'd built his career around. In the first Avenger, he's cowardly, self-interested, survivalist. And then the Winter Soldier reveals that this quality, the willingness to go wherever power takes you, to simply keep existing and working no matter who you're working for, is exactly what allowed him to be the most useful Hydra asset of the 20th century. His mind, preserved in a building-sized computer, has been running Hydra's long-term operations for decades after his biological death. His survival instinct, taken to its logical endpoint, became a kind of immortality. Not the noble kind. There's a real-world parallel here that the film uses deliberately. Operation Paperclip actually happened. The US government and NASA really did recruit former Nazi scientists after the war. The MCU places Hydra's infiltration in that same historical moment, and it grounds what could be a fairly fantastical conspiracy in something with genuine historical texture. The idea that institutional rot can enter through the front door wearing borrowed credentials is not invented from nothing. Hydra never died. That's the thing. After the war, the surviving Hydra agents, rather than being captured or destroyed, were folded into S.H.I.E.L.D. Project Paperclip, essentially, a real historical program in which the American government recruited former Nazi scientists and gave them new identities in exchange for their technical expertise. In the MCU, some of those people were Hydra. Not all of them, but enough. And they were patient. The plan Zola describes is remarkable in its simplicity and its horror. Hydra didn't try to seize power immediately. That would have triggered resistance. Instead, they generated crises, nudged events, created conditions of fear and instability. And into that instability, they placed a solution. Project Insight. 3 helicarriers, orbital platforms, connected to a satellite targeting network, capable of calculating, based on behavioral and communications data, who is likely to oppose Hydra's eventual control of society, and eliminating them before they can act. 20 million people targeted preemptively, not for anything they've done, for predictions about what they might do. This is, very explicitly, a commentary on surveillance and drone warfare and predictive policing that was quite timely in 2014 and doesn't feel any less relevant now. The technology has changed, the logic hasn't. Hydra's position is that freedom is a pleasant idea but a practical impossibility, and that people will eventually choose security over liberty if you terrify them enough. Hydra was founded on the belief that humanity cannot be trusted with its own freedom, Zola says, and every time humanity faced a crisis, it sent you crying to us. Democracy. Freedom. Those are just words. What the film is also doing, and this is the part I find actually unsettling on rewatch, is suggesting that the machinery of this control was built not by obvious villains, but by people who believed they were protecting the world. The SHIELD agents who weren't Hydra, the ones who built the helicarriers, who wrote the targeting algorithms, who maintained the surveillance networks, thought they were working for a legitimate defense organization. They were doing their jobs. They were following protocols. The rot was in the architecture, not in every individual brick. That's a harder thing to reckon with than a simple story about bad people doing bad things. Most of the people who built Project Insight probably slept fine at night. Steve's response to this, when Fury asks what he thinks they should do, is worth noting. We burn it down. Not reform, not oversight, burn it down. It's one of the most radical positions a mainstream blockbuster hero has ever taken, and the film treats it completely seriously. Sam Wilson comes into the story here and becomes essential. Sam is a former Air Force pararescue airman. He ran missions with a partner named Riley. They wore experimental wing rigs called Falcon suits. Riley was shot down and killed. Sam has been processing that loss through the VA, running a support group for veterans. He meets Steve on his morning run. They fall into pace together. They connect over the experience of coming back from something and not quite knowing how to fit back into ordinary life. That connection is worth pausing on. Sam is the first person in the modern era who relates to Steve not as a symbol or a military asset, but as someone who has gone through something. He's not impressed by the transformation or the history. He's interested in the actual person, which is rarer than it should be in Steve's current life. And Steve, for his part, immediately clocks that Sam is someone who has both the emotional intelligence to understand loss and the practical competence to be truly useful in dangerous situations. They're friends within about 20 minutes of screen time. It feels earned rather than convenient. When things go wrong, Sam opens his apartment to Steve and Natasha without hesitation. When Steve asks him to come along on what is clearly a very dangerous, unofficial operation against a world-class spy organization, Sam says yes. Because Sam Wilson is in some ways a Steve Rogers for the present day, someone who acts according to his own moral compass rather than his institutional loyalties, who understands the weight of sacrifice because he's carried it personally. The helicarrier sequence is one of the longest sustained action set pieces in the MCU, and it works not because of the spectacle, but because the emotional stakes are so clear. Steve and Natasha and Sam are trying to replace targeting chips on all 3 helicarriers before the launch sequence completes. Time and Hydra operatives are working against them. And on one of those helicarriers is the Winter Soldier, who has been sent to stop them. The confrontation between Steve and Bucky is the emotional centre of the film. Steve removes his helmet. He refuses to fight. He keeps calling Bucky by his name. James, Bucky, I know you. I know you're still in there. And absorbs blow after blow. You're my friend, Steve says. You've known me my whole life. Your name is James Buchanan Barnes. And the Winter Soldier, for a moment, hesitates. His programming flickers. He says with genuine confusion, "Who the hell is Bucky?" It's devastating, in exactly the right proportion. The film doesn't over-dramatize it. It just shows you the moment, this highly trained, conditioned assassin hearing a name he doesn't recognize that is somehow also his own, and not knowing what to do with that. Steve falls into the Potomac afterward. The helicarriers destroy each other. As intended, Project Insight is stopped, but Steve goes into the water, and Bucky pulls him out. Half conditioned, half remembering, in the middle of his own internal collapse, Bucky pulls Steve out of the river and then walks away into the world. The aftermath is enormous. S.H.I.E.L.D. is over. Fury fakes his death. Natasha dumps the entirety of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s files, including her own, to the public, which is a form of confession and a form of recklessness simultaneously. The world learns that the organization that was supposed to protect it was compromised from within. And Steve and Sam, sitting by a hospital bed, decide they're going to find Bucky. That last decision is characteristic. The world has just been told that a 70-year-old super spy agency was secretly run by the organization that lost World War II. And Steve's response is, right, what do we do next? He's already moving, already looking at the problem in front of him rather than the scale of what just fell apart. That's his nature, and it's both his greatest quality and the thing that occasionally leads him into choices that are harder to defend in hindsight, but we'll get to those choices. Because Civil War is where the question of whether Steve Rogers is actually right about everything gets properly tested. That last decision is characteristic. The world has just been told that a 70-year-old super spy agency was secretly controlled by the organization that lost World War II, and Steve's response is, right, what do we do next? He's already moving, already looking at the problem in front of him, rather than the scale of what just fell apart. That's his nature, and it's both his greatest asset and the thing that occasionally leads him into choices that are harder to defend in hindsight. But we'll get to those choices, because Civil War is next, and Civil War is where the question of whether Steve Rogers is actually right about everything finally gets properly interrogated. Civil War is a film that's easy to misread as a superhero versus superhero action piece, which it is on the surface, but which underneath is a very specific argument about accountability and the nature of oversight. The Sokovia Accords, the United Nations document that sits at the center of the conflict, are not a villainous piece of legislation. That's important. They're a reasonable response to a real problem, and Tony Stark, of all people, is the one making the case for them, which says something about what he's been carrying since Ultron. The Avengers, over the course of several films, have caused a lot of collateral damage. New York, Washington, D.C., Sokovia, Lagos, where the film opens with a mission that goes badly when Wanda, trying to contain a suicide bomber, deflects the explosion upward into a crowded building. 11 aid workers killed. The world is watching, and the world has questions about who authorizes these operations, who is accountable for the casualties, who decides when the Avengers deploy and when they don't. The Accords propose that a UN panel oversees all Avenger operations. Deployment requires authorization. Actions are subject to review. The Avengers become accountable to a multinational body rather than purely to themselves. Tony signs. Steve won't. Tony's position is emotionally driven, more than it might appear. There's a scene early in the film where a woman confronts him at an MIT event. Her son was in Sokovia when Ultron pulled the city into the sky, and he died. She hands Tony a photo. Tony builds things, and Tony breaks things, and he has been living with the knowledge of the second part for a while now. The Accords feel to him like a way to put a structure around something that has been running without one. Steve's objection is simpler. He doesn't trust the people who would be making the decisions, not because he thinks they're corrupt, or not only that, but because he believes that when it counts, when the moment of genuine need arrives, a committee of politicians in Geneva is not going to act fast enough, or may choose not to act at all for reasons of political convenience. I don't want to see another Sokovia either, he says, but I'm not willing to trade the safety of millions of people for the comfort of having somebody else's signature on the decision. Both positions are coherent. That's the point. The film doesn't tell you who's right because it's not certain who's right, and anyone watching it is invited to pick a side or to see themselves in both simultaneously. I've had this argument with people in real life essentially, the same argument in different clothes, about accountability versus effectiveness, about whether oversight improves institutions or merely slows them. It doesn't resolve neatly, neither does civil war. T'Challa arrives in this film as a third position, which is under-discussed. He signs the accords, he believes in them, but he also goes outside them to pursue his father's killer personally, which is a rather large contradiction. And when he discovers that he's been pursuing the wrong person, that Zemo manipulated him, he makes the most mature decision in the film. He doesn't kill Zemo. He says, "The cycle of violence that consumed Zemo's life is not something I'm willing to perpetuate." That's not weakness. That's judgment. T'Challa arrives in the MCU fully formed in a way that most new characters don't, and Civil War earns a lot of credit for introducing him so effectively. Peter Parker's appearance is a bit of an odd tonal moment. This kid from Queens, 17 years old, in a ramshackle homemade spider suit, entirely too cheerful for the situation. And the film doesn't quite know whether to take him seriously or treat him as comedy relief. He's a bit of both. He's clearly effective in the fight, and Tony clearly has feelings about having recruited a teenager into a potentially very dangerous situation. But the Avengers do all seem to like him, even the ones on the opposite side of the argument. It's hard not to. Zemo is the piece that makes the whole thing collapse. Helmut Zemo is one of the better MCU villains specifically because he has no powers, no resources beyond what he can assemble, and no ambition for global domination. His son died in Sokovia. His father died in Sokovia. His wife died waiting for news of his father. The Avengers' battle with Ultron destroyed the life Zemo had built, and his response to that is, entirely understandably, entirely inexcusably, to destroy the Avengers in return. Not by fighting them, which he correctly identifies as a losing proposition, but by making them fight each other. The plan is meticulous. He tracks down a Hydra kill order from 1991 that shows the Winter Soldier being deployed to intercept a vehicle on a Romanian road. In that vehicle, Howard and Maria Stark, Tony's parents. What the world believes was a car accident is, on the recording Zemo recovered, clearly a targeted assassination carried out by a brainwashed Bucky Barnes on Hydra's orders. Steve knows this by the time of Civil War. He knew it, or strongly suspected it, before the film begins. He didn't tell Tony. That decision, made probably for the right reasons, to prevent exactly the response it eventually triggers, becomes the specific knife Zemo slides between them. And here is where Civil War, most interestingly, complicates its own hero. Steve is wrong. Not about his general principles, not about the accords, but about the specific decision not to tell Tony. You can construct a defense of it. The information would have been devastating. Tony was already volatile. It might have fractured the team long before the crisis that required them. But the film doesn't offer that defense. It lets Steve's silence stand as a genuine failure, something that made a bad situation much worse. Steve Rogers, the man with the moral compass, made a choice that prioritized his loyalty to Bucky over Tony's right to know something about his own family. That's human. That's also a mistake. The airport battle is spectacular and, in the context of what's actually happening, kind of tragic. Giant Man punches a building. Spider-Man, all of 17, is quipping about his Star Wars feelings. Vision accidentally shoots Rhodey, who falls from an enormous height and is partially paralyzed. And then it's over, and Zemo's real endgame kicks in. Siberia, an abandoned Hydra facility, the recording, and Tony's grief consuming everything. Steve in that frozen bunker fighting Tony to protect Bucky is not entirely right. Tony trying to hurt the person who killed his parents is not entirely wrong. And Zemo, watching it on cameras from another room, has achieved everything he wanted. The Avengers are broken. He didn't lift a finger. Steve leaves the shield in Siberia, deliberately. It was made by Tony's father, and in this moment Steve doesn't feel that he has the right to it. That's a detail that carries a surprising amount of weight. The act of putting it down is not defeat exactly, but it is a recognition that something is over. At least for now. He and Bucky go to Wakanda. Bucky goes back into cryostasis, his own request, because he doesn't trust himself, while the Winter Soldier programming remains active, and Steve goes into the shadows. He becomes a fugitive. He becomes someone history has misplaced again. What Civil War does that most superhero films avoid is refuse to declare a clear winner on its central argument. You can rewatch it multiple times and come away with a different reading depending on what you bring to it and what's been happening in the world. The Sokovia Accords are reasonable in isolation. The institutions administering them are compromisable. Steve's instinct to operate outside oversight is philosophically grounded. His specific application of that instinct here costs people he loves. Both things are true simultaneously, and the film doesn't blink. The letter Steve sends Tony is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's one of those small narrative details that does a lot of work. He writes by hand. He acknowledges the damage without defensive framing. He says that the Avengers are his family, and that he would do the same thing again, protect Bucky, not sign away their autonomy, but that he regrets the cost to Tony specifically, and he leaves a phone, an actual mobile phone, with just one number programmed in. Call if you need us. Tony keeps the phone. For years, he moves on, builds a cabin upstate, has a daughter, settles into a life, but the phone is still there, the line is still open. That detail, carried quietly from Civil War through to Endgame, is about as good a shorthand for a fractured friendship as anything the franchise has done. Two people who got everything wrong about each other's choices, and still, at the bottom of it, couldn't fully give up on each other. There's something quietly Shakespearean about the Steve and Tony relationship across the whole franchise. They are both good people who are wrong about each other in specific, consequential ways. They bring out the best in each other in the field and the worst in each other in the abstract. The MCU never asks you to choose which of them you'd rather be. It asks you to hold both of them as complex and incomplete, which is the more honest and more interesting invitation. The Steve Rogers of Infinity War and Endgame is different from the Steve Rogers of the previous films, in ways that are easy to overlook, because he doesn't get as much screen time as Iron Man or Thor in those entries. He's been living off the grid for 2 years, no shield, no name, or rather, he's been operating under the call sign Nomad, though the film doesn't actually use that word on screen. He's grown a beard, which the internet found very significant. He's working with a small team of fugitives, Sam, Natasha, Wanda, Vision. He's still doing it, still going out and stopping bad things where he can find them. Still the same moral compass, just without any institutional backing, which arguably makes him more pure as an expression of the Captain America ideal than when he had the costume and the shield affiliation. The symbol and the man have separated, and the man is still showing up. He and Tony never reconcile properly before Thanos arrives. There's a letter. Steve sends it to Tony after the events of Civil War, acknowledging the damage that's been done, offering to help if Tony ever properly needs it. Tony keeps the phone Steve left him. He doesn't call. And then Thanos happens, and Tony goes to Titan and Steve goes to Wakanda, and they are never in the same place until the aftermath of the snap, by which point half of everything is gone. There's a scene in Endgame that a lot of people focus on because it's visually striking, but that I find quietly devastating for different reasons. Steve sitting in a support group in 2023, 5 years after the snap, talking to a group of people about how they're managing their grief, and he has this small smile when someone describes going on a first date again, because that person's world kept moving, and that's what he's been telling people to do. Move with it. Steve has been doing this. In between whatever operations he and Natasha are still running, whatever covert work remains, he's been sitting in church basements, helping people process their loss, which is, at its core, exactly the same thing the small sickly kid from Brooklyn was always doing, trying to help the people in front of him with whatever's available. He doesn't have the shield. He doesn't have the costume. He has his presence and his willingness to sit with people in difficult things. The snap. Half of all life across the universe removed in an instant because one person decided it was the most efficient solution to a resource problem. The Avengers fail to stop it. All of them together in 2 different locations fail. Thanos wins. And then there are 5 years of living in that reality. Natasha spends those 5 years running what's left of the Avengers as an operation, and Steve is part of it. They're both doing the work with no institutional backing and no particular recognition. The world is grieving, and they are attempting to hold together what's left of the infrastructure that keeps people safe. It's a quiet kind of heroism, unglamorous, persistent, without any prospect of immediate resolution. Very Steve Rogers, very Natasha Romanoff. Her death in Endgame, giving her life at Vormir so Clint can bring back the Soul Stone, is one of the losses the film doesn't fully sit with, because the story needs to keep moving. But Steve carries it, in the way he carries all of it. Another person gone, another absence that becomes part of the texture of who he is. The time heist produces one of the quietly delightful moments of the franchise. Steve in 2012 during the events of the original Avengers, running into his own past self, who tries to arrest him. Future Steve says, "I know I can do this all day," which past Steve has just finished saying to someone else. Present Steve's expression is hard to read, but seems to contain something in the vicinity of mild embarrassment. He also has to talk his way out of it by telling himself that Bucky is alive. He knows himself well enough to know that will work. There's something funny and a bit sad about that simultaneously, knowing the precise lever to use on your own psychological state, because you've lived inside it for long enough. And then the Mjolnir moment, Age of Ultron planted the seed carefully. Steve at the party reaches for the hammer. It moves very slightly, just enough that Thor notices. The film moves on, and Steve never mentions it again, and 4 years of real time later, in the final battle of Endgame, Thor is pinned, and a hammer comes screaming across the battlefield into Steve's hand like it was always going to. "I knew it," Thor says, absolutely delighted. What that moment means in terms of the character is worth sitting with. Mjolnir is enchanted, only the worthy can wield it. And whatever that means in cosmic terms, in human terms, it reflects back something about Steve. He has always been the person who would sacrifice himself, always been the person who acts without needing approval or recognition, always been the person who carries the weight and doesn't ask for it to be lighter. The final battle of Endgame is enormous and deliberately overwhelming. There's an intention there to make you feel the scale of what the 5 years built toward. But the moment that works most cleanly, in a quiet way, is Steve after that battle, after Tony's death, after the time comes to return the stones. Bruce and Sam are at the quantum tunnel waiting for Steve to come back. And he doesn't, because he chose not to. He went to 1945. He stayed. He lived a life with Peggy Carter, the life that was interrupted by the ice. He watched the decades pass. He grew old. There are questions the film deliberately leaves unanswered about this decision, and they're worth sitting with, rather than resolved. If Steve lived through the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, if he was alive during the same decades Bucky was being used as the Winter Soldier, Did he know? Could he have done something? The film's position seems to be that whatever Steve did in the past, he navigated it without disrupting the timeline he knew, but the specific mechanics are left quiet. Some viewers find this frustrating. I find it honest. The film is telling a story about a person choosing peace, not a story about the logical paradoxes of time travel. What matters is that Steve chose, not what the consequences of that choice were for the mechanics of the timeline. What the choice says about Steve, though, is interesting. He chose Peggy. He chose a life. He chose rest. And there's something in that which is fully consistent with the character we've been watching. He did what was necessary, for as long as it was necessary, and when the moment came where someone else could carry it, he set it down and chose something for himself. He never asked for the sacrifice. He made it anyway, twice, coming out of the ice the first time, staying through everything that followed. And then, when he had the option, he took the life. The old man on the bench with the shield is one of those images that, if the films had done everything right up to that point, lands absolutely correctly. He hands the shield to Sam. He doesn't explain himself extensively. He just says it feels right, and Sam holds the shield. For a moment, just holds it. And the question of what that means, for Sam specifically, in 2019, in America, is exactly the question that Falcon and the Winter Soldier is going to spend 6 episodes trying to answer. There's an argument to be made that Bucky Barnes' arc is the emotional spine of the Captain America story, in the same way that Steve's is the moral spine. They do different things. Steve represents what you aspire to. Bucky represents what can be done to a person, and whether you can come back from it. What Hydra did to Bucky in the time between his fall from the train and his appearance as the Winter Soldier is worth laying out clearly because the films are somewhat elliptical about it. He was found at the base of a mountain alive, having survived a fall that should have killed him. His partial exposure to a version of the super soldier serum during Project Rebirth apparently contributed to this, though the films are loose on the specifics. His left arm was destroyed in the fall. Hydra replaced it with a vibranium alloy prosthetic. Then the conditioning began. Memory suppression. First, systematic elimination of identity, relationships, personal history. Repeated cryogenic freezing over decades, which means that Bucky, who was born in 1917, spent most of the 20th century in suspended animation, thawed periodically for a specific mission, and then put back. He was used on at least 26 confirmed kills across multiple decades in multiple countries. He is simultaneously a man of about 30 in biological terms, and someone who has been alive since the First World War. The activation sequence, the series of trigger words in Russian that put him into full Winter Soldier mode, represents the most complete violation of a person you can achieve without killing them. He's not a robot, there's someone in there. Bucky Barnes is in there, suppressed and inaccessible, while this other thing operates his body and carries out orders he hasn't consented to. The specific words, as the show reveals them: longing, rusted, 17, daybreak, furnace, 9, benign, homecoming, 1, freight car, 10 words in Russian. That's what Hydra built as the switch, and the show demonstrates, with cold deliberateness, that Zemo has them memorized, that he can still use them, that the work Shuri did in Wakanda makes Bucky resistant but doesn't guarantee immunity. It's a scene that's hard to watch for exactly the reason it's included. The reminder that the most intimate form of control anyone can have over another person is access to the mechanisms of their own mind. When Steve refuses to fight him on the helicarrier and just keeps saying his name, what he's doing is refusing to treat Bucky as the weapon Hydra made him, refusing to engage on those terms. And it reaches something, eventually, not enough to undo the conditioning instantly, but enough to make Bucky pull Steve out of the river. The person who's been buried under all that programming, does one thing, one human thing, out of those long decades of nothing. The recovery process is not quick or clean. Bucky goes into Wakandan cryostasis, partly because he asks to, because he doesn't trust himself while the conditioning is still active, and the programming can still be triggered. T'Challa's scientists work on deprogramming him while he's frozen, removing the activation sequence, isolating and neutralizing the Hydra conditioning. When he wakes up, in Infinity War briefly, before Thanos, he's calmer. More himself. Shuri has been working on him. The detail that it's Shuri who does the deprogramming work is quietly significant. Shuri is 17 roughly at the time of Infinity War. She's the most technically brilliant person in Wakanda, possibly in the world, and she sits with Bucky's memories essentially. She goes through the architecture of his conditioning and dismantles it carefully, like diffusing something. That's not a small thing. It's probably the most intimate violation you can do to a person's autonomy and personhood. This work of going inside someone's mind and removing things that were put there without consent, and it requires someone with extraordinary both technical skill and a certain kind of patience and care. Shuri has both. The Wakandans call him the White Wolf. It's a name that comes with no expectation attached to it, no history, no role. Just a name given to a person who showed up and needed one. There's something healing in that, I think. Being in a place that doesn't know what you used to be, that sees you as you are now, rather than as the thing that was made of you. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which we'll come to properly in the next section, Bucky is working through what he calls his amends. He has a book, an actual notebook, of people he needs to apologize to, people he hurt as the Winter Soldier, people connected to people he killed. He shows up at their doors and sits in their living rooms and does not ask for forgiveness, because he knows he doesn't get to ask for that. He just tries to acknowledge what happened and do what he can to make it less wrong. The notebook is an interesting mirror of Steve's notebook of things to catch up on, both of them using the same simple tool, a list in a book, to manage the impossible task of catching up to their own existence. Steve's list is about moving forward. Bucky's is about going back and facing things he'd prefer not to face. One of those people is an older Wakandan man named Yuri, whose son was killed by the Winter Soldier on a mission in 1991. Bucky befriended Yuri without telling him who he was, which made the amends feel easier, more manageable. And then when he finally tells Yuri the truth, who he is, what he did, why he came, the scene is handled with a kind of quiet devastation that's hard to shake. Yuri doesn't scream. He doesn't forgive Bucky. He just sits with it and asks Bucky to leave. Bucky's arc is ultimately about the distinction between punishment and accountability. He can't be punished for what he did in any proportionate way. The crime's too many, the intent too absent. But accountability, the act of bearing witness to what's happened, of not looking away from it, of showing up to the people who were hurt and saying, yes, that was me, and I am sorry, that Bucky can do and does. It doesn't resolve anything, it doesn't restore anything, but it's what's available to him, and he does it. There's also a question the show raises without answering completely. Who is James Buchanan Barnes now? Not the Winter Soldier, obviously, but also not quite the young man who fell from the train in 1944. The intervening decades happened to him, even if he wasn't conscious for most of them. He's aware of things that happened during those decades, because the records exist. He knows the shape of what he was used for. The question of identity after that level of systematic destruction is not something you resolve in a 6-episode series, and the show is smart enough not to pretend otherwise. The metal arm, by the time we get to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, is a Wakandan-made replacement, sleeker, lighter, with a star on the shoulder rather than the red star of the Soviet program. A visual statement. The same arm, made new. Still Bucky's, but on different terms. There's a final thought about Bucky that I think is worth landing on before we move forward. By the end of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, his future is open in a way that Steve's never quite was. Steve's story always had the weight of destiny in it. The serum, the war, the ice, the mission. Bucky's story is one of someone trying to figure out what they are when nobody is giving them a mission anymore. That's a different and in some ways harder question. Who are you and what do you do when the context that defined you for decades is finally gone? The show doesn't answer this entirely, and I think that's appropriate. Some questions take longer than 6 episodes. Sam Wilson's decision at the end of Endgame is not to pick up the shield immediately. He holds it, he looks at it, and his expression contains about 14 different feelings simultaneously. And then in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, the show opens with him donating it to the Smithsonian. This is the correct decision, and also, from a character perspective, a fascinating one. Sam doesn't feel that it's his to take, not because he lacks the qualities for it. He is by any reasonable measure exactly the kind of person the Captain America identity is supposed to represent. But because the symbol has a history, and that history is complicated, and you don't just pick up a thing that's complicated and assume it fits. The government's response to the shield being in a museum is to create a new Captain America. John Walker is introduced with full ceremony, patriotic fanfare, late-night show appearances, a genuine attempt by the US military to manufacture the thing that Steve Rogers was, which is a bit like trying to manufacture conviction. Walker is not a bad person when we meet him. That's important. He's decorated, he's skilled, he's earnest in a way that's recognizable, he wants to do the job well. The show would be considerably less interesting if he was simply a villain from the start. But the qualities that made Steve Rogers Captain America were never the result of training or institutional backing. They were the result of a specific kind of character, built by a specific kind of life, identified by a scientist who understood that the serum was a test rather than a solution. Walker has the credentials. He doesn't have the thing underneath the credentials. And the show is quite patient about demonstrating what happens when you give the symbol to someone who has everything except that. The Flag Smashers are the antagonists of the show, and like the best MCU antagonists, their position is not entirely wrong. Carly Morgenthau leads a movement of people who lost their homes and communities when half the world came back after the blip. When 5 years of refugee resettlement, temporary housing, new borders and new arrangements were suddenly disrupted by the return of 3.5 billion people who'd been gone. The people who'd adapted, who'd built something new in the absence, lost everything a second time. Carly's response to that is violent and increasingly extreme, and the show doesn't excuse the violence, but it doesn't dismiss the grievance either. There's a line where she says the world was actually better during the blip, for people who'd been overlooked and displaced for their whole lives before it, and the show sits with that, rather than immediately rebuffing it. The Madripoor section of the show is where the franchise's geography gets interesting. Madripoor is this fictional city-state, a sort of noir Hong Kong in the Marvel geography, run by a criminal power structure. It's where Sam and Bucky track the super soldier serum to a figure called the Power Broker. And it's where Sharon Carter reappears, Peggy's great niece, last seen helping Steve and Bucky flee the authorities in Civil War. She's been living in Madripoor, a fugitive, never pardoned for what she did in Civil War. The show uses her as a pointed observation about how the system treats people who sacrifice for its ideals when those ideals are no longer convenient. And then there's Isaiah Bradley. Isaiah Bradley is the piece of this story that doesn't have an easy analogue in the main film series, and it hits differently because of that. During the 1950s, the US government ran its own super soldier program, attempting to recreate Erskine's work, because as we established, the formula died with him, and multiple institutions have been reaching for it ever since. They used black soldiers as test subjects. Without their consent, or with consent obtained under conditions that weren't exactly free, Isaiah Bradley survived the process and became functionally a super soldier. And then the government, wanting to avoid the liability of what they'd done, wanting to bury the evidence of the program, imprisoned him for 30 years. His family was told he was dead. He came home to nothing. He's bitter. He's earned the bitterness. When Sam finds him and asks about the shield and the Captain America legacy, Isaiah's answer is the most uncomfortable thing in the show. They will never let a black man be Captain America. Not as a prediction, as a statement of documented historical behaviour. The country that produced the Captain America symbol also produced Isaiah Bradley, and produced what happened to him, and those two things are not separable. The same institutional impulses that created a hero also created the conditions for his imprisonment. Sam takes this seriously. He doesn't argue with it. He carries it. The scene afterward, Sam sitting with the weight of what Isaiah told him, is one of the quieter, more effective character moments in the MCU's television output. The show doesn't rush past it. John Walker's arc accelerates toward its crisis point when the Flag Smashers kill his partner. Walker gets the super soldier serum from a black market source, and then in a moment of grief and rage, kills a Flag Smasher publicly, on camera, in a public square. Not in battle, execution, with the Captain America shield. The image is specific and deliberate. That shield, covered in blood. The government removes Walker's title and strips his rank, and Sam and Bucky recover the shield. There's a conversation between Sam and Bucky in Louisiana, where Sam's family is from, where they work on fixing Sam's family's boat, a fishing vessel in disrepair, and it becomes the show's emotional fulcrum. Sam and Bucky just exist together, doing manual work, talking without performance. They pull a rope together, and it requires them to cooperate, and they manage it badly at first and then manage it well. It's the quietest the show gets, and it's where their friendship becomes real. Sam's speech at the end of the show, in the suit that Wakanda built for him, with the wings and the shield, is not a triumphant declaration. It's a question directed at the senators watching. He asks them whether the people who've lost something because of the blip, because of big decisions made without them, whether they matter. He asks them what it means that a man with a shield and a costume is more visible than the suffering of millions of ordinary people. He says it loudly, in public, and refuses to back down from it. It's the most politically direct moment the MCU has had, and it's followed by a community cookout on the Louisiana waterfront, which is maybe the correct tonal landing for a show like this. Life goes on. The work continues. The shield now belongs to someone who understands what it costs. Brave New World arrived in 2025, and it marks the first time a Captain America film has existed in a post-Steve Rogers world. Not in the background of a team film, not in a Disney Plus series, a proper theatrical film titled Captain America, fronted by Sam Wilson, which is either a natural progression or a very conscious act of redefinition, probably both. 5 months before the film begins, Thaddeus Ross has become President of the United States, which is a quite strange sentence to write out, and I don't think the MCU always gets credit for the structural boldness of that choice. Ross is not a sympathetic figure in his earlier appearances. He's the man who spent years hunting Bruce Banner, who authored the framework that fractured the Avengers, who represents exactly the kind of institutional authority that Steve Rogers spent 3 films being dubious of. Making him president isn't a redemption arc or a joke. It's a serious examination of what happens to power when it finds legitimate channels. This takes a moment to absorb, if you've been following the MCU for a while, because Ross's history in the franchise is not exactly one of enlightened governance. He spent years hunting Bruce Banner's Hulk. He was the author of the Sokovia Accords, the framework that split the Avengers in Civil War. He is, institutionally speaking, the kind of authority figure that Steve Rogers spent several films being skeptical of, and now he's president. Sam and Joaquin Torres, the new Falcon, younger and considerably more enthusiastic, which works as a deliberate contrast to Sam's earned skepticism, open the film in Oaxaca, recovering stolen classified material from a mercenary group called the Serpents. It's a clean operation with one loose thread. The leader, Sidewinder gets away. The classified material turns out to be adamantium, which is something the MCU has been building toward for a while now. Celestial Island, the landmass that emerged from the Indian Ocean when the celestial Tiamut surfaced during the Eternals, contains deposits of adamantium, the metal that in Marvel Comics is most famous for coating Wolverine's skeleton and claws, though that particular application hasn't arrived in the MCU as yet. Ross is trying to establish an international treaty governing adamantium's extraction and distribution, positioning himself as the architect of a new global framework. This is where things get complicated. At a White House summit, a song comes on. Mr. Blue by the Fleetwoods, a 1959 record, gentle and nostalgic, and several men in the room immediately begin shooting at President Ross. It's a trigger, a conditioning mechanism, familiar in its structure to anyone who spent time thinking about what was done to Bucky Barnes. Mind control, programmatic compliance. The response is contained by Ruth Bat-Seraph, Ross's head of security, and a former Black Widow agent, excellent at her job, extremely dangerous, and one of the more interesting additions to the MCU roster in recent years. She stops the attack, but the fact that it happened at all, in the White House, with that particular mechanism, points somewhere specific. Thaddeus Ross himself is carrying something he hasn't told anyone about. He was exposed to a modified version of the Hulk formula sometime prior to the film's events. The transformation it triggers is not Bruce Banner's Green Hulk, it's Red, the Red Hulk. Larger, more aggressive, driven by rage in a way that the Banner Hulk, at his most controlled, was not. Ross spent years as the institutional opponent of the Hulk, the man who argued that uncontrolled enhanced individuals were a threat to public safety, and has now become, involuntarily, exactly the thing he spent his career opposing. There's a kind of structural irony there that the MCU handles better than it sometimes does with these things. Ross isn't a hypocrite exactly. He didn't seek this out, but his transformation makes literal the question of whether power corrupts, whether the people who most want oversight of extraordinary capability can be trusted with extraordinary capability themselves. Sam navigates all of this without enhanced abilities. No serum, no gamma radiation, the wings, the shield, the training, the judgment. That's it. And the film is very deliberate about this, in a way that connects back to what Erskine was saying about the relationship between capability and character. The costume doesn't make the hero, the character does. Sam choosing to be there, choosing to hold the line against something that physically outclasses him by a considerable margin, is itself the Captain America statement. Thaddeus Ross himself is carrying something he hasn't told anyone about. He was exposed to a modified version of the Hulk formula sometime prior to the film's events. The transformation it triggers is not Bruce Banner's Green Hulk, it's Red, the Red Hulk. Larger, more aggressive, driven by rage in a way that the Banner Hulk, at his most controlled, was not. Ross spent years as the institutional opponent of the Hulk, the man who argued that uncontrolled, enhanced individuals were a threat to public safety, and has now become, involuntarily, exactly the thing he spent his career opposing. There's a kind of structural irony there that the MCU handles better than it sometimes does with these things. Ross isn't a hypocrite exactly. He didn't seek this out, but his transformation makes literal the question of whether power corrupts, whether the people who most want oversight of extraordinary capability can be trusted with extraordinary capability themselves. It's a question the film doesn't fully answer, partly because Ross isn't a villain in the film, or not simply a villain. He's a man in an impossible situation who makes some wrong choices while trying to make right ones, which is a more complicated portrait than the franchise usually offers its authority figures. Torres, for his part, is figuring out what it means to be the Falcon when the Falcon has become Captain America. There's a generational dynamic here. Torres is young enough that his reference points for heroism include Sam himself, not just Steve Rogers. He doesn't carry the weight of what the shield meant in the Second World War or the Cold War. He sees it as something Sam built, and he's learning from that rather than from a history he wasn't present for. This is actually something the franchise does with real intentionality in Brave New World. Each generation of hero carries the legacy differently. Steve Rogers carried the weight of what he knew personally: the war, the soldiers he led, the friends he lost. Sam Wilson carries the weight of what it meant historically and politically for him specifically to be handed that shield. Torres carries what Sam has built, with more room to define it for himself because the heaviest historical questions have already been asked and partially answered by the people before him. The mantle gets lighter as it passes, not because the responsibility decreases, but because each carrier does the work of making it more clearly defined. Where Brave New World lands feels genuinely uncertain in an interesting way. The world of the MCU circa 2025 is one where the institutional frameworks for heroism, S.H.I.E.L.D., the Sokovia Accords, the Avengers as a formal team, have all either collapsed or been fundamentally restructured. What's left is individual people making individual choices, operating in a geopolitical landscape that's been permanently altered by aliens and gods and a man who erased half of all life. Sam Wilson is Captain America in that context. Not in a simpler context, not in the context that Steve Rogers inhabited. And the film, to its credit, doesn't pretend that's easy, or that the symbol means the same thing now that it did in 1943. What it means is something Sam is still working out, which feels right, actually. The character who doesn't have all the answers, who keeps asking the uncomfortable questions rather than delivering the comfortable answers, that's who ought to be holding the shield right now. The other thing worth noting as we come toward the end of the current Captain America story is the Isaiah Bradley resolution in the show, which feeds into the broader question of what the shield represents for Sam. At the end of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Sam ensures that Isaiah Bradley is recognized, that a statue is placed in the Captain America Museum exhibit, that his story is told as part of the history rather than erased from it. Isaiah is brought to see it, and his reaction is complex and not entirely resolved. Recognition is not the same as justice. A museum plaque doesn't restore what was taken, but it is a refusal to continue looking away. And for Sam, carrying a shield whose history includes Isaiah Bradley's story, that refusal is necessary. You can't carry the symbol honestly without acknowledging the full weight of what it's been attached to. That's where the Captain America story is, an ongoing question, honestly held, carried by someone who keeps asking it even when the answers are uncomfortable. And there's one more thread in this story that doesn't resolve at the end of Brave New World, and that I find really interesting to think about. The question of what Captain America is for, in a world where the Avengers are no longer a functioning team. Steve Rogers operated in contexts where there was always a shield, or at least the memory of one, a framework. Sam Wilson has none of that. He and Torres are operating essentially independently in a world that has been through things no institutional framework was built to handle. What does Captain America mean when there's no team? What does the symbol protect when the system it was created within has fundamentally changed? I don't think the franchise has answered that yet. I think it's the question the next few entries will have to answer, and that is a good place for a story to be, carrying a genuine question forward rather than a pre-packaged answer. What's clear from everything Brave New World sets up is that Sam Wilson is operating in uncharted territory. Steve Rogers had the Avengers. He had S.H.I.E.L.D. for a while. He had frameworks, even when he distrusted them. Sam has a suit, a partner, a family in Louisiana, and a set of values he's determined not to compromise. That's the entire infrastructure. And the film treats this not as a tragedy, but as a genuine form of independence. Operating without institutional backing means operating without institutional compromise, which is exactly the position Erskine would have recognised. Something I keep coming back to, turning over quietly, is the thread that connects all of these people and all of these stories. Erskine's philosophy. The serum amplifies what's already there. That's where it begins. It begins with a scientist who believed, against considerable, available evidence, that human character matters more than human capability. That the right person, given the means, will do more good than the powerful person given the same means, and who staked his entire project on a sickly kid from Brooklyn who kept trying to enlist because he couldn't stand bullies. And from there, Steve Rogers in the ice for more than 6 decades, waking up to a world he didn't choose, choosing to serve it anyway. Bucky Barnes, buried under decades of conditioning, pulling a friend out of a river because something in him refused to fully disappear. Sam Wilson holding a shield that wasn't made for him in any obvious historical sense, asking out loud whether it should be his and what it would mean if it were, and eventually deciding that the questions themselves are part of the answer. Joaquin Torres, learning what the Falcon means from a man who learned what Captain America means by refusing to be told. The shield passes. The symbol accumulates meaning and history as it passes. It gets complicated and then more complicated still. Isaiah Bradley is part of the history of that symbol, whether the Smithsonian exhibit acknowledges him or not. The Howling Commandos are part of it. Bucky's metal arm and his notebook of amends are part of it. The old man on the bench in the future, handing it over with a quiet smile, is part of it. And here's the thing about the shield as a symbol that I find worth sitting with at this hour. It's round. Erskine didn't choose the shield. Howard Stark had it sitting against a wall. Steve picked it up because it felt right in his hand. And it has no edges. That's not nothing. A weapon with no edges is something that can only protect. It can deflect, absorb, return, but it cannot cut anyone. It can only stop things. Every time the Captain America symbol has been at its best, in the war, in Washington, in Sam Wilson's speech to those senators, it's been used to stop something, to hold a line, to say, this far and not further. What I find moving about it, and I don't use that word lightly, especially at this hour, is that the story has never been about power. None of the truly important moments in the Captain America saga are about how strong Steve is, or how fast Sam is, or what the vibranium shield can withstand. They're about what people choose when the choice costs them something, about whether the person inside the symbol is actually living up to it, or whether the symbol is doing the work of covering for someone who isn't. Steve Rogers was Captain America before the serum. That's Erskine's point, and the franchise's point, and it's a point worth carrying forward. There's a lot more MCU lore where this came from. I'm planning to go through the full Iron Man saga at some point, and Thor's story has some fascinating threads running through all 4 films that I don't think get discussed enough. Bucky's future in the MCU is also truly open and interesting in ways that the recent material has only begun to address. And there's a whole dimension of the Captain America story that connects outward into the Wakandan arc, the question of what the world's most advanced nation has been doing while the rest of the world needed rescuing, which is its own rich vein. The Howling Commandos deserve their own video. The history of S.H.I.E.L.D. before its fall deserves its own video. The parallel legacies of Steve Rogers and Tony Stark, 2 different answers to the same question about what heroism costs, could fill several hours. Tonight we've covered the main thread, the central line, but the MCU is built for exactly this kind of slow, recursive exploration, where every time you think you've understood something, there's another layer underneath. But for tonight, this is where we rest. Brooklyn in the 30s, the ice, the river, the bench, Washington in 2025, with a different man in a different time, carrying the same idea forward. The thread is unbroken. The people holding it are different. The thing it's tied to is the same. That's the Captain America story, more or less. Classified, they said. I think we've done all right. Sleep